The Messerschmitt Me 210 entered Luftwaffe service in 1941 with specifications that suggested it would dominate every role assigned to it. Maximum speed of 385 miles per hour, range exceeding 1,200 miles. Armament heavier than any twin-engine fighter than operational. The design replaced the Bf-110, which had proven vulnerable in the Battle of Britain, with an aircraft that promised to correct every deficiency its predecessor had revealed. Messerschmitt AG had delivered prototypes that met performance targets. The Reich Air Ministry had approved production before operational testing was complete. By the spring of 1942, units equipped with the Me 210 were reporting loss rates that exceeded combat attrition. Aircraft were spinning into the ground during routine maneuvers. Pilots were bailing out of unflyable machines that had suffered no battle damage. The Me 210 had been designed to surpass the Bf-110 in every measurable category. It had succeeded on paper. In the air, it killed its own crews with efficiency that enemy fighters could not match. The Me 210 was conceived in 1937 as a heavy fighter and fast bomber capable of fulfilling multiple roles: long-range escort, ground attack, reconnaissance, and bomber interception. Messerschmitt's design incorporated lessons from the Spanish Civil War, where the Bf-110 had demonstrated both the value and limitations of twin-engine fighters. The new aircraft featured a shorter fuselage to improve maneuverability, a redesigned empennage with twin vertical stabilizers for better control at high speed, and more powerful Daimler-Benz DB61 engines producing one 475 horsepower each. Armament included two 20mm MG-151 cannon and two 7.92 mm MG-17 machine guns in the nose, plus remotely controlled rearward firing guns in barbettes on each side of the fuselage. Bomb load capacity reached 200 pounds. The specifications exceeded the Bf-110 in speed, firepower, and operational radius. Testing at Augsburg demonstrated that the aircraft could achieve the promised performance figures. Dive tests confirmed structural integrity. Gunnery trials validated the effectiveness of the remote barbette system. Ernst Udet, responsible for Luftwaffe aircraft development, approved mass production in September 1939, months before the first prototype had completed its test program. The decision was driven by urgency. The Luftwaffe needed a modern heavy fighter immediately, and the Me 210 appeared ready to fill that requirement. Messerschmitt received contracts for over 1,000 aircraft before flight testing had revealed the design's fundamental instability. By 1941, the Luftwaffe's operational environment had evolved into sustained multi-front combat that demanded aircraft perform reliably under conditions far removed from test flight profiles. Heavy fighters operated over the Eastern Front in temperatures ranging from -40 degrees Celsius in winter to extreme heat in summer. Missions over the Mediterranean required flight over open water with no emergency landing options. Bomber escort sorties demanded formation flying at cruise speed for hours, followed by immediate combat maneuvering when interceptors appeared. Ground attack missions involved low-altitude flight through anti-aircraft fire, requiring precise control and rapid evasive maneuvers. Pilots were often recently trained replacements with limited experience in complex aircraft. Maintenance occurred at forward airstrips with minimal facilities. Test flights at Augsburg had been conducted by experienced test pilots in fair weather, with full ground support and no combat pressure. Single flight evaluations could not reveal problems that emerged only during sustained operations or under the stress of combat maneuvering. The gap between controlled testing and operational reality was about to manifest in ways that would ground the entire fleet. The first Zersterer units received the Me 210 in early 1941. Initial familiarization flights proceeded without incident under calm conditions. Pilots noted heavier control forces compared to the Bf-110, but attributed this to the aircraft's increased performance. The first losses occurred during formation training. An aircraft entering a climbing turn at reduced speed stalled without warning and entered a spin. The pilot recovered at low altitude after losing 3,000 feet. A second aircraft spun during a similar maneuver and impacted the ground, killing both crew. Accident investigators found no mechanical failure. A third loss followed within days, under nearly identical circumstances. Squadron commanders suspended advanced maneuvering training pending investigation. Test pilots at Rechlin conducted spin trials with the Me 210 and confirmed what operational crews had discovered. The aircraft exhibited vicious stall characteristics with little warning, and recovery required altitude and technique most pilots did not possess. The shortened fuselage and redesigned tail, both intended to improve agility, had destabilized the aircraft. The problem had existed in the prototypes. It had been noted in test reports. It had not been considered severe enough to halt production. By the time operational squadrons confirmed the deficiency, over 350 aircraft had been delivered. The Luftwaffe had committed to an aircraft that could not safely perform basic combat maneuvers. The instability originated in the aerodynamic interaction between the fuselage, wing, and empennage, a relationship that wind tunnel testing had not accurately predicted, and that flight testing had not fully explored. Messerschmitt had shortened the fuselage by nearly 5 feet compared to the Bf-110 to reduce weight and improve roll rate. This placed the tail surfaces closer to the wing's turbulent wake. During slow flight or high angle of attack maneuvers, airflow over the wings separated and struck the horizontal stabilizers in a disrupted, unsteady state. The stabilizers lost effectiveness, reducing the pilot's ability to control pitch. The aircraft's nose would rise unpredictably, increasing angle of attack further, which deepened the stall. The twin vertical stabilizers, positioned in the wake of the stalled wing, provided insufficient directional control to prevent the aircraft from yawing into a spin. Recovery required immediate nose, down input, and opposite rudder, but the controls were heavy and response was delayed. Pilots accustomed to the Bf-110's forgiving stall behavior found the Me 210's abrupt departure from controlled flight disorienting. Several pilots died attempting recovery procedures that had worked in previous aircraft, but which were inadequate for the Me 210's characteristics. The second failure involved the remote, controlled barbette gun system. The barbettes protruded from the fuselage sides, creating localized disruptions in airflow. At high speed, these disruptions generated buffeting that resonated through the airframe. Pilots reported severe vibration that made instrument reading difficult and induced fatigue during long missions. The vibration also indicated structural stress. Several aircraft developed cracks in the fuselage skin near the barbette mounting points. Messerschmitt had tested the barbette system statically and during limited flight trials, but not during sustained high-speed flight representative of operational profiles. The barbettes had been designed for functionality, not aerodynamic integration, and the cost was paid in structural integrity and pilot workload. The third issue was directional stability at cruise speed. The twin vertical stabilizers, sized to provide control authority during single-engine flight, were too small to adequately stabilize the aircraft in yaw during normal operations. The Me 210 required constant rudder corrections to maintain heading, particularly in turbulence or when flying in formation. This was exhausting on long missions and degraded bombing accuracy during ground attack sorties. Pilots described the sensation of fighting the aircraft continuously, unable to trim it into stable flight. The problem was inherent in the tail design. Enlarging the vertical stabilizers would have added weight and drag, negating performance advantages. Messerschmitt had optimized for speed and agility at the expense of stability, a trade-off that might have been acceptable for a short-range interceptor, but was untenable for a multi-role heavy fighter expected to perform extended missions. The fourth failure, less dramatic but operationally significant, was cockpit layout and crew coordination. The pilot and radio operator gunner sat in tandem with limited visibility. The radio operator controlled the barbette guns via periscope sights, a system that required practice and clear communication with the pilot. In combat, with both crew members occupied and under stress, coordination broke down. Gunners could not effectively track targets. Pilots maneuvered without knowing whether the gunner was ready to fire. Several aircraft were damaged by friendly fire when gunners lost situational awareness. The system had been tested individually. The guns worked. The sights functioned. But the integration of human operators under combat conditions had not been adequately evaluated. Unit commanders responded with measures that acknowledged the aircraft was unsafe in its current configuration. Advanced maneuvering was prohibited below 10,000 feet. Stall speed margins were increased, which reduced combat effectiveness but prevented inadvertent spins. Formation flying was limited to straight and level flight. Ground attack missions were reassigned to other types. These restrictions reduced the Me 210's utility to the point where it could not perform the missions it had been designed for. Pilots who had transitioned from the Bf 110 requested to return to their previous aircraft, accepting its known limitations over the Me 210's unpredictable behavior. Accident rates remained elevated even with restrictions in place. Between April and August 1941, ZG-1 lost 14 the Me 210s to non-combat accidents, primarily spins and structural failures. Morale in affected units deteriorated. Replacement crews arrived, were briefed on the aircraft's characteristics, and approached their first flights with apprehension that operational veterans confirmed was justified. This was not cowardice. It was rational assessment. The aircraft was killing crews at rates that suggested systemic design failure, and the institutional response was procedural restrictions rather than grounding the fleet. The Luftwaffe began withdrawing the Me 210 from frontline service in late 1941. The withdrawal was not announced as a failure. Units were told they were re-equipping with improved variants. In practice, Me 210s were transferred to training units. then grounded entirely as spare parts, were diverted to other types. Messerschmitt initiated a redesign that lengthened the fuselage, enlarged the tail surfaces, and relocated the barbette guns. The result was designated the Me 410, effectively a different aircraft. It entered service in 1943 and performed adequately, but production numbers were limited, and it never achieved the operational significance intended for the Me 210. Official records attributed the Me 210's withdrawal to technical development delays, a phrase that obscured the reality that the aircraft had been operationally deployed before it was safe to fly. Ernst Udet, whose decision to approve production prematurely had contributed to the disaster, died in November 1941. His death was officially ruled an accident. Post-war analysis suggested suicide, though the cause was never conclusively determined. The Me 210 program was not cited as a factor, but the aircraft's failure had damaged his credibility and strained relations with Joar Ring. Messerschmitt AG continued operations, but internal reviews criticized the decision to prioritize performance over stability. Engineers who had raised concerns during development were quietly reassigned. The institutional response was organizational, not accountability. The Me 210 had been feared by its own pilots more than by the enemy. It had promised to dominate the battlefield with speed, firepower, and versatility. It had delivered an aircraft that could not be safely maneuvered, that vibrated dangerously at combat speeds, and that required constant correction to maintain stable flight. The testing had measured performance. It had not measured survivability. The specifications had demanded capabilities. They had not accounted for the compromises required to achieve them. Design decisions made to optimize individual characteristics had created an aircraft whose systems interacted in ways that were unstable and, under combat conditions, lethal. By 1942, the Me 210 had been withdrawn, redesigned, and effectively erased from Luftwaffe planning. It remained in historical records as a footnote, an aircraft that had looked decisive on paper and had failed completely in the air, where decisions were actually made.